The 13th century produced many theologians, but none who so fundamentally reshaped the relationship between faith and reason as the large, silent student his classmates called the dumb ox. His teacher, Albertus Magnus, is said to have prophesied that the bellowing of this ox would one day fill the whole world. 8 centuries later, the prophecy continues to unfold. Thomas Aquinas, born into Italian nobility around 1225, would construct an intellectual edifice of such scope and coherence that it became the foundation of Catholic philosophy and a touchstone for debates about God, nature, and human purpose that persist into our own time. The ambition of Aquinas' project can scarcely be overstated. He sought to demonstrate that the wisdom of pagan antiquity and the truths of Christian revelation were not enemies, but partners in a single pursuit of truth. Could Aristotle's philosophy, recovered through Arabic translations and seemingly at odds with Christian doctrine, be reconciled with the teachings of Scripture and the Church Fathers? Could reason illuminate faith without diminishing mystery? Could one man synthesize the entire range of human knowledge, from the nature of God to the structure of virtue, from the existence of angels to the mechanics of how we know a tree when we see one? Thomas Aquinas was a man of extraordinary physical presence and equally extraordinary intellectual absorption. Contemporary accounts describe him as large and heavy, moving slowly, speaking little, often so lost in thought that he seemed absent from his surroundings. At the royal court of King Louis IX of France, he once struck the table during dinner and exclaimed about a solution to a theological problem, entirely oblivious to where he was. His secretary, Reginald of Piperno, would find him weeping while writing about the Passion of Christ. He was capable of dictating to multiple scribes simultaneously on different topics, his mind working on several intellectual levels at once. Yet for all his mental power, those who knew him remarked on his gentleness, his patience with opponents, his refusal to speak ill of anyone. The questions he pursued were not merely academic. At stake was whether the new learning pouring into Europe from the Islamic world could be integrated into Christian thought, or whether it represented a dangerous threat to faith. At stake was whether human reason had genuine autonomy in investigating the natural world, or whether every truth had to be derived directly from Scripture. At stake was the very possibility of a Christian philosophy, a systematic account of reality that began from faith but employed the tools of logic and metaphysics to explore the deep structures of being. Aquinas devoted his relatively short life to this project with single-minded intensity. His literary output staggers the imagination. The Summa Theologica alone, though left unfinished at his death, comprises millions of words in its modern editions. Add to this the Summa contra Gentiles, his commentaries on nearly all of Aristotle's works, his disputed questions, his biblical commentaries, and a host of shorter treatises, and one confronts a mind of almost superhuman productivity. He wrote with astonishing clarity and organizational power, constructing arguments with the precision of geometric proofs while grappling with questions that touch the deepest mysteries of existence. Yet the story of Thomas Aquinas is not merely one of intellectual achievement. It is the story of a vocation pursued against family opposition, of years spent in study and teaching at the newly founded universities, of fierce controversies with fellow scholars, of mystical experiences that transcended all his formulations. It ends with one of philosophy's great enigmas. On December 6th, 1273, while celebrating Mass, Aquinas underwent an experience so profound that he ceased writing entirely. When his secretary urged him to continue his work, he replied that everything he had written seemed like straw compared to what he had seen. 3 months later, he was dead at the age of 49. What did he see? We cannot know. But what he wrote before that vision remains an extraordinary testament to the power of human reason operating in service of faith, to the possibility of holding together dimensions of reality that our age often tears apart. To understand Aquinas is to enter a worldview radically different from our own, yet addressing questions that remain urgently contemporary. How can we know anything for certain? What is the foundation of morality? Can God's existence be demonstrated? What does it mean to live a good human life? What is our ultimate purpose? These questions occupied Thomas from his youth until the day he stopped writing. The answers he proposed, argued with relentless logic and defended against countless objections, constitute one of the most comprehensive philosophical systems ever attempted. That system begins not with abstractions but with a life, with the concrete circumstances of a boy born in the shadow of Monte Cassino who would become the angelic doctor. Thomas was born around 1225 in the castle of Roccasecca, a fortress in the kingdom of Sicily near the town of Aquino, from which his family took its name. His father, Landulf, was a knight in the service of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a connection that placed the family within the complicated politics of medieval Italy. His mother, Theodora, came from Norman nobility. Thomas was the youngest of at least 9 children in a family of considerable standing and ambition. The world into which he was born was one of castles and monasteries, of feudal obligations and ecclesiastical preferments, of the long struggle between pope and emperor that would define the age. The political landscape of 13th century Italy defies simple description. The peninsula was divided among competing powers: the Kingdom of Sicily in the south, the Papal States across the centre, the republics and city-states of the north. The Holy Roman Emperor claimed authority over much of this territory, but the Pope disputed those claims, and the result was chronic warfare between Guelph and Ghibelline factions, supporters of papal or imperial authority. Into this turbulent world, Aquinas was born, his family's fortunes tied to the emperor, even as the great monasteries offered alternative paths to power and influence. At the age of 5, Thomas was sent to the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict himself in the 6th century and the cradle of Western monasticism. This was not primarily a religious decision, but a strategic one. Noble families commonly placed younger sons in the church, where they might rise to positions of authority and wealth. Monte Cassino was one of the richest and most powerful monasteries in Italy, and Landulf harboured hopes that his son might one day become its abbot. The boy would receive an education, certainly, but more importantly, he would be positioned for ecclesiastical preferment. The monastery sat atop a mountain overlooking the surrounding countryside, a city unto itself, with libraries, workshops, farms, and churches. Here Thomas received his first systematic education in the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, followed by the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. He studied the Bible and the Church Fathers, particularly Augustine, whose theology dominated Western Christianity. He learned Latin, the language of learning and liturgy, and began to develop the intellectual habits that would characterize his mature work. We know little of Thomas's inner life during these years, but we can infer certain things from what followed. He was a quiet child, thoughtful, given to long periods of reflection. He showed early signs of the intellectual power that would later astonish his teachers, and at some point during his years at Monte Cassino, he conceived a question that would never leave him. What is God? The story comes to us through early biographers, and whether it happened exactly as reported we cannot say, but it captures something essential about the boy. He did not ask how to serve God or how to be saved, though these were the questions monasticism existed to answer. He asked what God is, a metaphysical question, an inquiry into the nature of ultimate reality itself. This question, philosophical rather than devotional, would shape everything that followed. It was the question of a mind that needed to understand, that could not rest in piety alone, but had to probe the foundations of faith itself. It was a dangerous question in some ways, the kind that leads either to heresy or to a synthesis more comprehensive than anything attempted before. For Thomas, it would lead to the latter. His education at Monte Cassino ended abruptly in 1239, when political conflicts between Frederick II and Pope Gregory IX made the monastery unsafe. The monks were expelled, and Thomas, now about 14, had to leave. His family sent him to the University of Naples, one of the first true universities in Europe, founded by Frederick II himself in 1224. This decision would prove fateful. Naples was an intellectual crossroads, a place where the new learning from the Islamic world was making itself felt, where Aristotle's works were being read and debated, where ideas percolated that would have been impossible at Monte Cassino. At Naples, Thomas encountered two forces that would determine the course of his life. The first was Aristotle. The Greek philosopher's works had been lost to Western Europe for centuries, but were now returning through Arabic translations and commentaries. These texts offered a comprehensive account of reality based on observation and reason rather than revelation, a philosophy that seemed at points to contradict Christian teaching. The eternity of the world, the impossibility of personal immortality, the denial of divine providence in earthly affairs, these were some of the Aristotelian positions that troubled Christian theologians. Yet the sheer explanatory power of Aristotle's system was undeniable. Here was a philosophy that accounted for motion and change, for the nature of knowledge, for ethics and politics, all without reference to the Bible. The second force Thomas encountered at Naples was the order of preachers, known as the Dominicans. This was a new kind of religious order, founded only 2 decades earlier by Dominic de Guzman. Unlike the Benedictines, who lived in fixed monasteries devoted to prayer and manual labour, the Dominicans were mendicants, owning no property and supporting themselves by begging. They were dedicated to preaching and to study, convinced that the defence of Christian truth required intellectual rigour and theological sophistication. They were establishing themselves at the universities, training friars in philosophy and theology to combat heresy and to engage with the new learning. To his family's horror, Thomas was drawn to the Dominicans. Exactly when he joined the order is uncertain, but it was likely in 1244 when he was about 19. This was not the future Landulf had envisioned for his youngest son. The Dominicans were poor, itinerant, lacking the prestige and security of the great Benedictine monasteries. Worse, they were taking Thomas away from Italy, planning to send him to Paris for further study. The family saw this as a waste of their investment in his education and a threat to their ambitions. What followed was a crisis that revealed both Thomas's determination and the lengths to which his family would go to bend him to their will. The intellectual ferment of 13th century Naples cannot be understood apart from the larger transformation overtaking Europe. For centuries, Western Christendom had possessed only fragments of the ancient philosophical tradition, some Plato in translation, Boethius's commentaries, the logical works of Aristotle. The great systems of Greek philosophy, the scientific treatises, the metaphysical and ethical texts had been lost when the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But these works had not perished. They had been preserved, studied, and developed by Islamic scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. Now, through the work of translators in Spain and Sicily, this treasure was returning to Latin Europe. Aristotle's physics, metaphysics, de anima, Nicomachean ethics, and politics were becoming available, accompanied by the commentaries of Islamic philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, and the Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides. This influx of learning posed enormous challenges to Christian theology. Here was a complete philosophical system, developed without knowledge of Christ or Scripture, offering explanations of the natural world based purely on reason and observation. At the University of Naples, Thomas absorbed this new learning with an intensity that alarmed some of his teachers and thrilled others. He studied under Peter of Ireland, and Martin of Dacia, masters who were themselves grappling with how to integrate Aristotelian philosophy with Christian faith. He read the Physics and learned Aristotle's account of motion, potency, and act. He encountered the Metaphysics and its analysis of being, substance, and causation. He studied the De Anima and its theory of the soul as the form of the body. Each of these texts raised profound questions about their compatibility with Christian doctrine. Consider the question of the world's eternity. Aristotle had argued that the cosmos had always existed, that motion and time stretched back infinitely into the past. But Christian teaching, based on Genesis, held that God created the world in time, that there was a beginning. Which was true? Could both be true? Or did one have to choose between philosophy and faith? Some scholars, particularly at the University of Paris, were beginning to argue for what would later be called the doctrine of double truth, that something could be true in philosophy but false in theology, or vice versa. Thomas would reject this solution utterly, but confronting the problem required intellectual tools of great sophistication. Or consider the nature of the soul. Aristotle defined the soul as the form of the body, the principle that makes a living thing alive and gives it its specific character. This meant that the soul was not a separate substance imprisoned in the body, as Plato had taught, but the very actuality of the bodily organism. The implications were troubling. If the soul is the form of this particular body, how can it survive the body's death? Aristotle's own text seemed to suggest that individual souls do not survive, that only some kind of impersonal intellect is immortal. Yet Christian faith insisted on personal immortality and bodily resurrection. The tension was acute. These were not idle academic puzzles, but questions that struck at the heart of Christian self-understanding. Could Greek philosophy, developed by pagans, ignorant of revelation, guide Christians in understanding reality? Or was philosophy inherently dangerous, a source of errors and heresies? The conservative Augustinian tradition, dominant in the universities, was deeply suspicious. Augustine had drawn heavily on Platonism, but had subordinated philosophy to faith, insisting that true wisdom came through divine illumination, not human reason. Many theologians in this tradition saw Aristotelianism as a threat to be contained or rejected. But Thomas saw something else. He saw the possibility of a synthesis, a way of integrating Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology that would honor both the autonomy of reason and the primacy of revelation. He saw that Aristotle's errors, where they existed, arose not from the proper use of reason, but from incomplete information. Aristotle had not known about creation ex nihilo because reason alone cannot establish that the world began in time. This is a truth that requires revelation. Aristotle had not understood personal immortality because he lacked the Christian doctrine of resurrection, but his own principles, properly understood, were compatible with that doctrine. The task was to distinguish what reason could know from what required faith, and then to show that the two did not contradict but complemented each other. This conviction grew in Thomas during his years at Naples, reinforced by his encounters with the Dominican friars. The order of preachers was dedicated to truth, to study, to the defense of faith through argument rather than force. Dominic himself had confronted the Albigensian heresy in southern France, not with the sword, but with preaching and disputation, convinced that error should be overcome by reason and persuasion. The order he founded was structured around this commitment. Every friar was to study, every priory was to have a library, learning was to be pursued with the same intensity as prayer. Thomas found in the Dominican ideal a vocation that united his intellectual gifts with his religious commitments. Here was an order that valued philosophy, that sent its members to universities, that believed the life of the mind could be a form of service to God and neighbour. The Dominicans wore simple white habits and black cloaks, owned nothing individually or collectively beyond necessities, and depended on the charity of others. They were despised by many in the established church as upstarts and radicals. But to Thomas, they represented the future of Christian thought. His decision to join them, made around 1244, was an act of defiance against his family's plans. Landulf was dead by this time, but Thomas's mother Theodora and his brothers were very much alive and furious. They saw his choice as a betrayal, a throwing away of opportunities, a descent into poverty and obscurity. The Dominicans, sensing trouble, decided to move Thomas out of Italy quickly. They arranged to send him to Paris, then the intellectual capital of Christendom, where he could continue his studies and be beyond his family's reach. But Theodora was not willing to lose her son so easily. She appealed to his brothers, who were soldiers in the emperor's service. What followed was a kidnapping that reads like adventure fiction, but reveals the deadly seriousness with which noble families guarded their prerogatives. The details of Thomas's abduction come to us through early biographies, particularly that written by William of Tocco within decades of his death. While we must allow for some hagiographical embellishment, the basic facts appear solid and are corroborated by multiple sources. In 1244, as Thomas and several other Dominicans were travelling north toward Paris, they were ambushed by armed men near the town of Aquapendente. Thomas's brothers, Rinaldo and Landulf, had organised the attack. They seized Thomas, drove off his companions, and took him back to the family holdings. He was not harmed, but he was imprisoned. His family moved him between several castles, including Roccasecca and Monte San Giovanni, keeping him under guard. The siege lasted at least a year, perhaps longer. Theodora and her sons employed every argument they could muster to change Thomas's mind. They appealed to family honour, to the opportunities he was throwing away, to the disgrace of begging in the streets. They offered him the abbacy of Monte Cassino, without his having to become a Benedictine, an astonishing compromise that reveals how desperately they wanted to redirect his path. They threatened and cajoled. Thomas remained unmoved. He asked for his Dominican habit, which they refused. He requested books, which they eventually provided, and he spent his imprisonment in study. He taught his sisters, who were allowed to visit him, about the religious life. He debated with anyone who came, defending his choice with arguments they could not answer. His intellectual formation continued even in captivity. He later said he had learned more in that year than in many years of formal study, for he had time to read and think without distraction. The crisis came when his brothers, despairing of persuasion, resorted to a cruder strategy. They sent a prostitute into his chamber, hoping to seduce him and thus prove he was unsuited for celibate religious life. The story that has come down to us, dramatically rendered by William of Tocco, tells that Thomas seized a burning brand from the fireplace and drove the woman from the room, then used the brand to trace the sign of the cross on the wall. He fell into deep prayer, and that night, it is said, he had a vision in which angels appeared to him and strengthened his resolve. Whether or not we credit the supernatural elements, the story captures something true about Thomas's character. His single-mindedness, his refusal to be deflected from what he saw as his calling. Eventually, his family relented. The sources differ on exactly how his release came about. Some say Theodora, impressed by his constancy, arranged for him to escape by lowering him from a window. Others suggest his brothers simply gave up. In any case, by 1245 Thomas was free and back with the Dominicans. The order, having won this particular battle, wasted no time. They sent him to Paris and then to Cologne to study under the greatest Dominican scholar of the age, Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great. This imprisonment was more than a biographical episode. It was a test that revealed the depth of Thomas's vocation. He had chosen poverty and obscurity over wealth and position, intellectual freedom over family obligation, a new order over ancient tradition. These choices would shape everything that followed. They also reveal something important about Thomas's temperament. He was not a rebel or a romantic. He did not rail against his family or condemn them. He simply knew what he had to do, and no force on earth could turn him aside. This combination of gentleness and adamantine will would characterize his entire career. The year or more of imprisonment also gave Thomas time to absorb and meditate on the texts he was reading. Aristotle's works, the commentaries of Averroes and Avicenna, the theological treatises, he studied them all with the focused attention that only solitude allows. By the time he arrived in Cologne to study under Albert, he had already formed the conviction that would guide his life's work, that faith and reason could not ultimately contradict, because both came from God, who is truth itself. The task was to demonstrate this, to show how philosophy and theology complemented rather than competed with each other. It was an enormous undertaking, one that would require not just learning, but creative synthesis. And he would have the ideal teacher for such a project. Albertus Magnus was a phenomenon. Born around 1200 in Swabia, he entered the Dominican order in 1223 and quickly established himself as a scholar of astonishing range. He wrote on logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, theology, botany, zoology, mineralogy, astronomy, and alchemy. He was called the Great and the Universal Doctor, and later generations would speak of him as the teacher of Thomas Aquinas, though Albert would outlive his famous student by 6 years. When Thomas arrived in Cologne around 1245, Albert was at the height of his powers, lecturing on Aristotle and developing his own synthesis of the new learning. Albert's project was nothing less than the baptism of Aristotle. He believed that Christian scholars needed to master Greek philosophy on its own terms before attempting to integrate it with theology. He systematically commented on nearly all of Aristotle's works, explaining them, correcting them where necessary, and showing how they could be understood within a Christian framework. This was controversial work. Many conservative theologians viewed Aristotle as dangerous, a pagan whose errors might corrupt the faithful. But Albert persisted, convinced that truth could not contradict truth, that whatever was genuinely demonstrated by reason could not conflict with what was revealed by faith. Thomas arrived in Cologne as a young friar, probably in his early 20s, large and quiet and enormously learned. His fellow students, not yet recognizing his brilliance, called him the dumb ox because of his size and his silence. He rarely spoke in class, and when he did, his comments were brief and to the point. One of his classmates, taking pity on what he assumed was a slow student, offered to tutor him. Thomas accepted graciously. During the tutoring session, as they worked through a difficult text, the classmate became confused. Thomas quietly explained the passage with such clarity that the would-be tutor realized his mistake. Word spread, and the nickname took on a different connotation. The famous moment came when Albert, who had recognized Thomas's ability from the start, assigned him to participate in a public disputation. These disputations were a central feature of medieval university life. Formal debates on philosophical or theological questions where students and masters would present arguments, raise objections, and defend their positions before an audience. Thomas's performance was so impressive that Albert reportedly made his prophecy. "We call this young man a dumb ox, but I tell you that the bellowing of this ox will resound throughout the whole world." Under Albert's guidance, Thomas immersed himself in Aristotelian philosophy. He studied the Organon, Aristotle's logical works, and learned the art of rigorous argumentation. He worked through the Physics, absorbing its account of motion, change, causation, and the structure of the natural world. He read the Metaphysics, encountering Aristotle's profound analysis of being, substance, essence, and the causes of things. He explored the De Anima, grappling with its theory of the soul and its account of how knowledge arises from sense experience. He examined the Nicomachean ethics and politics, learning Aristotle's understanding of virtue, happiness, and the good life. But Thomas did not simply absorb Aristotle, he engaged with him critically, learning to distinguish what was soundly demonstrated from what was merely asserted, what could be reconciled with Christian faith from what required correction or rejection. He also studied the Islamic and Jewish commentators who had preserved and developed Aristotelian thought. Avicenna's distinction between essence and existence, his proof of God's existence as the necessary being, his understanding of the soul's immortality, these would all influence Thomas's mature philosophy. Averroes's commentaries on Aristotle, though containing positions Thomas would reject, showed the power of rigorous philosophical argument. Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed demonstrated how a faithful monotheist could employ Aristotelian categories while maintaining religious orthodoxy. The years with Albert were formative in another way as well. They showed Thomas a model of how a Christian scholar should approach philosophy, with respect for the arguments themselves, with fairness to opponents, with precision in definitions and distinctions, with humility before the evidence. Albert never browbeat Aristotle into conformity with Christian doctrine. He let the arguments stand or fall on their merits, confident that where Aristotle erred, better reasoning could show the error. This method, patient, meticulous, charitable to all sides, would become Thomas's own. By 1252, Thomas was ready for the next stage of his career. He was sent to Paris to lecture on the Bible and the sentences of Peter Lombard, the standard theological textbook of the age. Paris was the intellectual centre of medieval Christendom, home to the greatest university in Europe, a city where thousands of students and masters debated the deepest questions of faith and reason. Here, Thomas would spend several periods of his career, teaching, writing, and engaging in the fierce controversies that shaped 13th century thought. Here he would begin the work that would establish his reputation and provoke both admiration and condemnation: the systematic integration of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. The Paris to which Thomas came in the 1250s was a battleground. Conservatives resisted the new learning, fearing it would undermine faith. Radicals, influenced by Averroes, pushed Aristotle's conclusions to heterodox extremes, arguing for the eternity of the world, the mortality of individual souls, and the impossibility of divine providence. The secular masters at the university resented the mendicant orders, seeing them as interlopers who violated university autonomy. Dominicans and Franciscans argued among themselves about the proper relationship between philosophy and theology. Into this cauldron of ideas and rivalries, Thomas brought a vision of synthesis and harmony. It would not be an easy sell. Medieval Paris was unlike any city before it. By the mid-13th century, it had become a magnet for students from across Europe, drawn by the fame of its university and the promise of studying under the greatest masters of the age. The University of Paris had emerged in the 12th century from the Cathedral schools and had received papal recognition and privileges that made it a corporation, a self-governing community of masters and students. It was organised into 4 faculties: arts, where students studied the 7 liberal arts and philosophy; medicine, law, and theology, the queen of the sciences, the pinnacle of learning. The Faculty of Arts was where students encountered Aristotle. By the 1250s, virtually all of the philosopher's works were available in Latin translation and formed the core of the curriculum. Students spent years studying logic, natural philosophy, metaphysics, and ethics before progressing to theology. This meant that every theologian had been trained as an Aristotelian philosopher, which both enabled and complicated the task of theological synthesis. the arts masters were increasingly bold in following Aristotle wherever he led, even to conclusions that troubled the theologians. The result was constant tension, periodic condemnations, and an atmosphere of intellectual ferment unmatched in medieval Europe. Thomas arrived in Paris to lecture on scripture and the sentences at the Dominican house of Saint-Jacques. He was still a young man, probably in his late 20s, but already recognized as exceptionally learned. The standard path to becoming a master of theology was long and arduous. After completing the arts curriculum, a student would spend years attending lectures, then more years as a bachelor, lecturing on the Bible, then as a bachelor of the sentences, lecturing on Peter Lombard's theological compendium. Only then, if judged worthy, could one be examined and admitted as a master, authorized to give magisterial lectures and participate fully in the university's governance. Thomas pursued this path with characteristic intensity, producing commentaries of great subtlety and originality. His commentary on the sentences, written between 1252 and 1256, already shows his mature method, careful distinction-making, exhaustive consideration of objections, precise use of Aristotelian concepts to clarify theological doctrines. But his path to the mastership was blocked by opposition from the secular masters, who resented the growing influence of the mendicant orders. The conflict came to a head in 1256, when both Thomas and the Franciscan Bonaventure were denied their degrees despite being clearly qualified. The dispute was partly about economics. The secular masters feared that the friars, who lived by begging and taught without charging fees, would undercut their livelihoods. But it was also about governance and academic freedom. The friars were answerable to their religious orders and ultimately to the Pope, not to the university corporation. This seemed to violate university autonomy. The secular masters, led by William of Saint-Amour, attacked the mendicants as hypocrites and false prophets. They appealed to the city, to the king, and to the Pope. The controversy threatened to tear the university apart. Pope Alexander IV intervened, ordering the university to admit Thomas and Bonaventure. They received their degrees in 1257 and began teaching as full masters. But the bitterness persisted. Thomas found himself defending the mendicant orders against charges of heresy and moral corruption. He wrote treatises on evangelical poverty and the legitimacy of the religious life. He engaged in public disputations where he had to answer hostile questions from colleagues who resented his presence. Through it all, he remained calm, answering arguments with arguments, never descending to personal attacks, modelling the intellectual charity that would characterize all his work. The other great controversy of these years concerned Averroism. Averroes, the great Islamic commentator on Aristotle, had argued for positions that seemed incompatible with Christianity: the eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect for all humans, and the consequent mortality of individual souls. Some arts masters at Paris, particularly Siger of Brabant, began teaching these positions as philosophical truths while claiming to accept their opposites on faith. This was the doctrine of double truth. What is true in philosophy might be false in theology, and vice versa. It was a way of protecting philosophical inquiry from theological censorship, but it struck many, including Thomas, as intellectual dishonesty and a betrayal of the unity of truth. Thomas rejected double truth absolutely. There is only one truth, he insisted, and it cannot contradict itself. If philosophy and theology seem to conflict, either the philosophy is bad or the theology is misunderstood. His response to the Averroists was characteristically thorough. He wrote detailed commentaries on Aristotle's works, showing where Averroes had misinterpreted the philosopher, and he composed treatises demonstrating that Aristotelian principles, properly understood, were compatible with Christian faith. He argued that Aristotle had not actually taught the eternity of the world as a demonstrated truth, but merely as a dialectical position. He showed that Aristotle's doctrine of the soul, while incomplete, did not require the denial of personal immortality. And he insisted that philosophy and theology were distinct sciences with different methods, but a common object: truth. These controversies shaped the mature Thomas in important ways. They forced him to clarify his understanding of the relationship between faith and reason, to develop sophisticated accounts of how we know things and how we speak about God, to defend the legitimacy of philosophy within a Christian framework. They also showed him the need for a comprehensive synthesis that would integrate all of Christian doctrine within a systematic whole, answering objections and showing the coherence of the entire faith. This need would lead to his greatest work, the Summa Theologica. But before turning to the Summa itself, we need to understand the intellectual foundations on which it rests. Thomas's philosophy is not merely a historical curiosity. It represents one of the most sustained and rigorous attempts ever made to think through the fundamental questions of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. At its heart lies a doctrine that is both simple and profound, the real distinction between essence and existence. To grasp this is to begin to see why Thomas thought faith and reason could harmonize, why he believed God's existence could be demonstrated, why he understood creation and creatures in the way he did. It is to this central metaphysical insight that we now turn. Before delving into the content of Thomas's philosophy, it is worth pausing to consider the form in which he chose to express it. The Summa Theologica is not a narrative or a meditation or a collection of essays. It is a summa, a comprehensive summary of Christian theology organized according to a rigorous logical plan. The genre had precedents: Peter Lombard's sentences, various summae of canon law and moral theology. But nothing before had attempted what Thomas proposed: a complete account of God, creation, and salvation presented in systematic order and accessible to beginners. Thomas began writing the Summa around 1265 while teaching in Italy. He worked on it for the next 8 years until his mystical experience brought the project to a halt. Even incomplete, it is massive. Modern editions fill multiple large volumes, comprising millions of words organized into 3 main parts and 614 questions subdivided into several thousand articles. Yet it was designed for students, a pedagogical work meant to replace the confusion of multiple textbooks with a single orderly presentation. The structure follows a grand narrative arc, known as exitus and reditus, going out and return. Part 1 treats God in himself, and as the source of all that is. It begins with questions about sacred doctrine, how we know anything about God, whether theology is a science. Then it turns to God's existence, demonstrating that God is, before asking what God is: simple, perfect, infinite, immutable, eternal, one. It examines God's knowledge, will, and power. It treats creation, the procession of creatures from their divine source. It discusses angels, the cosmos, the human soul, and the governance of creation. Part 2 examines the human journey back to God, the reditus. This is the longest section, divided into 2 parts. The first part of the second part considers happiness as the ultimate human end, the nature of human acts, the passions, habits, virtues and vices, law and grace. The second part of the second part takes up each virtue and vice in detail, examining faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and all their associated and opposed vices. It is an exhaustive moral psychology and ethics. Part 3 treats Christ as the way of return, the incarnation, Christ's life and passion, the sacraments. Thomas intended to cover all 7 sacraments and the final resurrection, but the work breaks off in the midst of the treatise on penance. His followers compiled a supplement from his earlier writings to complete the plan, but Part 3, as Thomas wrote it, ends abruptly, a monument left unfinished. Each question follows a standard format, the scholastic method of disputed questions. Thomas states a question, whether God exists, whether the soul is immortal, whether it is lawful to kill in self-defense. He then presents objections, arguments against the position he will defend, sometimes as many as 10 or 15. These objections are not straw men, but the strongest arguments from opponents, stated fairly and often with considerable force. Then comes the sed contra, on the contrary, a brief statement of an authority or argument supporting Thomas's position. This is followed by the respondeo, I answer, where Thomas presents his own solution, often at great length, developing distinctions and explanations. Finally, he replies to each objection in turn, showing where it fails or how it can be reconciled with the truth. This method has several virtues. It is dialectical, presenting opposing views and working towards synthesis. It is comprehensive, ensuring that all major positions are considered. It is fair to opponents, stating their arguments in their strongest form. And it is pedagogically effective, leading students through questions in a way that anticipates their doubts and answers them. The method also has limitations. It can feel mechanical, and it obscures the narrative and rhetorical power that appears in Thomas's other works. But for its purpose, systematic exposition of theology, it proved remarkably successful. The Summa's structure embodies Thomas's vision of reality. Everything flows from God and returns to God. Creation is not a fall, but a procession of the divine goodness into multiplicity. The human journey is not escape from the body, but the perfection of our composite nature through virtue and grace. Christ is not a cosmic magician, but the one who reunites divinity and humanity, enabling the return. The whole system holds together through a series of carefully articulated distinctions and principles, all rooted in the fundamental insight into the nature of being. To understand that insight, we must turn to metaphysics, to the question of what it means for something to exist. This is not an easy topic. It deals with concepts so fundamental that we use them constantly without noticing: being, existence, essence, substance, accident. Thomas takes these ordinary ideas and subjects them to rigorous analysis, revealing structures we did not know were there. The result is a vision of reality both strange and illuminating, one that will strike modern readers as alien in some ways but compelling in others. At its centre is the claim that in everything except God, what a thing is, and that it is, are really distinct. This is the real distinction between essence and existence, and everything else in Thomas's system depends on it. The question of being is the first question of philosophy, not in the sense that we ask it first, but in the sense that it underlies all other questions. Before we can ask what something is, we must recognize that it is. Before we can investigate properties or causes or purposes, we must grasp the being of the thing itself. Yet being is the most elusive of concepts. We cannot point to it, cannot isolate it from the things that have it. Every being is a being of some kind: a tree, a dog, a star, a thought. Being itself seems to slip through our conceptual fingers the moment we try to grasp it. Thomas inherits from Aristotle a sophisticated vocabulary for discussing being. There is substance, what exists in itself, and accident, what exists in something else. There is matter and form, potency and act. There are the four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final. But Thomas adds a distinction that Aristotle only hinted at, and that would become the cornerstone of his entire metaphysics: the real distinction between essence and existence. Essence is what a thing is, its nature or quiddity. The essence of a triangle is being a three-sided plane figure. The essence of a human is being a rational animal. The essence of water is being H2O, though Thomas did not know that particular chemical formulation. Essence answers the question what, and we can know and define essences without knowing whether any instances of them exist. We can define a unicorn perfectly well, a horse-like creature with a single horn, even though no unicorns exist. Existence is that a thing is, the actuality by which an essence is made real. It is not a property among others, but the act that makes all properties actual. A triangle drawn on paper exists. A triangle merely imagined does not. The difference is not in the essence, which is the same in both cases, but in the act of existing. Existence is what takes an essence from being merely possible to being actual. In creatures, Thomas argues, essence and existence are really distinct. They are not just different concepts or different aspects of the same thing. They are distinct principles actually composing the creature. The essence receives existence, is actualized by it, but does not include it. This is why creatures can cease to exist. Their existence is not necessary to their essence, is not included in what they are. A dog can die because being a dog does not entail existing. The dog's essence remains what it was, but it loses the act of existence. This might seem like hair-splitting, but the implications are profound. If essence and existence are distinct in creatures, then no creature exists by its own nature. Each requires a cause that gives it existence. This cause cannot be found in the creature's essence, which is merely potential until actualized. It must come from outside, from something that already exists in act. And if we trace the chain of causes back, we cannot go on infinitely with caused causes, each receiving existence from another. We must arrive at a being whose essence is its existence, a being that exists by its very nature and needs no cause. This is what Thomas means by God. Ipsum esse subsistens, subsistent being itself. In God alone, there is no distinction between essence and existence. God does not have existence. God is existence. His essence is to exist. This means God cannot not exist. It is impossible for God to cease to be or to fail to be. God is necessarily existent, not as a matter of logical necessity, but of metaphysical necessity. His very nature is the pure act of being. Everything else receives existence from God. Creation is not making things out of pre-existing material, but giving existence to essences that of themselves have no claim to being. The act by which God creates is not a manufacturing process, but the granting of existence itself, the causing of being from nothing. This is why creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, follows naturally from the distinction between essence and existence. If things do not have existence in their own right, then existence must be given to them, and not by fashioning something that already is, but by making something be that previously was not. The real distinction also explains why there can be many creatures but only one God. Since essence and existence are the same in God, there can be no multiplying principle. God is not a member of a species with other possible members. God is unique, singular, utterly one. But creatures in which essence and existence are distinct can be multiplied. There can be many dogs because the essence of dogness can be actualized in multiple individuals. The matter of each dog individuates it, makes it this particular dog rather than that one. But God, having no composition of essence and existence, having no matter, has no principle of individuation and cannot be multiplied. Thomas develops this metaphysics with extraordinary subtlety. He distinguishes 10 categories of being, substance, and 9 kinds of accidents. He analyzes the relationship between matter and form, showing how form actualizes matter and how their union constitutes a substance. He examines the 4 causes: the material cause, what something is made of; the formal cause, what it is, the efficient cause, what makes it, and the final cause, what it is for. He shows how potency and act are fundamental principles running through all of reality, explaining change, composition, and the relationship between the possible and the actual. All of this might seem abstract, but it has immediate practical consequences. It means that beings exist on a spectrum from pure potency, prime matter, to pure act, God. It means that everything finite is a composite, a mixture of actuality and potentiality, and therefore limited, dependent, in need of causes. It means that being is not a univocal concept, applied in exactly the same sense to everything, nor is it purely equivocal, applied in completely different senses. Being is analogical. It is attributed primarily to substance and secondarily to accidents, primarily to God and secondarily to creatures, but in a way that preserves real similarity and difference. The doctrine of analogy will become crucial when we ask how we can speak about God at all. But even before that, the metaphysics of being grounds Thomas's natural theology, his arguments for God's existence. If we understand that creatures are composites of essence and existence, that they do not exist by their own nature, then we can demonstrate that there must be a first being that does exist by its own nature. This is what the famous 5 ways attempt to show. Not that we intuit God or have some special religious experience, but that by careful analysis of the world around us, we can prove that God exists. To these arguments we now turn. Can God's existence be demonstrated by reason alone, without appeal to scripture or revelation? Many of Thomas's contemporaries said no. The Augustinian tradition held that knowledge of God comes through divine illumination and faith, not through unaided reason. Some argued that God's existence is self-evident, known immediately without need of proof. Others claimed that reason is too weak, too corrupted by sin, to reach God without the aid of grace. But Thomas, following Aristotle's principle that scientific knowledge proceeds from effects to causes, insisted that demonstration is possible. The famous 5 ways appear in the Summa Theologica, in the very first questions on God's existence. They are not the only proofs Thomas offers. He develops similar arguments in the Summa Contra Gentiles and other works, sometimes in greater detail, but they are the most concise and the most famous. Each takes a different observable feature of the world and shows that it requires a first cause, a necessary being, a perfect being, an intelligent designer. Taken together, they constitute a cumulative case for what Thomas calls the preambles of faith, truths about God that can be known by reason and that prepare the way for revealed truths that exceed reason. The first way argues from motion. We observe that things in the world are in motion, undergoing change, but nothing can move itself from potency to act. It requires something already actual to actualize it. A piece of wood, potentially hot, becomes actually hot when heated by fire, which is actually hot. But this actualizer must itself have been actualized by something prior. We cannot have an infinite regress of moved movers, because then there would be no first mover to start the series, and without a first, there can be no subsequent movers. Therefore, there must be a first unmoved mover, something that moves without being moved, that actualizes without being actualized. This we call God. This argument is often misunderstood. Thomas is not talking about motion in the sense of local motion, things moving from place to place. He means change in the Aristotelian sense, the reduction of potency to act, the process by which anything becomes what it was not. The argument does not claim that everything has a cause, but that everything that is being moved, being changed, is being moved by something already actual. The first mover is not a being that started the universe in the distant past and then stepped back. It is the sustaining cause of all actuality here and now, the pure act that keeps everything in being. The second way argues from efficient causation. We observe that things are caused by other things, but nothing can be the efficient cause of itself, because then it would have to exist before itself, which is absurd. Causes are ordered in series. This event is caused by that, which is caused by another. But we cannot have an infinite regress of efficient causes, because in such a series there would be no first cause, and without a first there would be no intermediate causes or final effect. Since there are effects, there must be a first efficient cause. This we call God. Again, the argument is not about temporal sequences stretching back into the past. Thomas is talking about essentially ordered causes, causes that depend on each other simultaneously for their causal power. A stick moves a stone, but it can do so only because a hand moves the stick, and the hand can move only because muscles contract, and muscles contract because of neural signals and so forth. Remove any link in this chain and the effect ceases. Such series cannot be infinite, they require a first member that has causal power in itself, not derived from another. This first cause is God. The third way argues from contingency and necessity. We observe that things in the world are contingent. They come into being and pass away, they might not have existed. But if everything were contingent, then at some time nothing would have existed, because given infinite time, every possibility is realized, including the possibility of universal non-existence. And if at some time nothing existed, then nothing could begin to exist, because nothing comes from nothing. Since things do exist, not everything can be contingent. There must be a necessary being, something that cannot not exist. This necessary being is either necessary through itself or receives its necessity from another. We cannot have an infinite regress of beings receiving necessity from others, so there must be a being necessary in itself. This we call God. This argument has been criticized as relying on questionable assumptions about infinite time and universal non-existence. But the core insight remains. Contingent beings, beings that do not have existence in their essence, require an explanation. That explanation cannot ultimately lie in other contingent beings, but must terminate in a being that exists necessarily, whose essence is existence. The fourth way argues from degrees of perfection. We observe that things possess qualities like goodness, truth, and nobility in varying degrees, but more and less are predicated in relation to a maximum. Things are hotter or colder in relation to what is hottest. There must therefore be something that is maximally true, maximally good, maximally noble, maximally being, and whatever is maximum in a genus is the cause of all things in that genus, as fire, which is maximally hot, causes heat in other things. Therefore, there is something that is the cause of being, goodness, and truth in all things. This we call God. This is the most Platonic of the five ways, and the one modern readers often find least convincing. It seems to assume that properties come in degrees arranged on a scale with a maximum, and that this maximum causes the lower degrees. But Thomas's point is more subtle. He is arguing that the very fact that we can judge things as more or less perfect implies a standard of perfection, and that this standard must be real, not merely conceptual. The source of all limited perfection must be unlimited perfection itself. The fifth way argues from teleology, from the governance of the world. We observe that natural bodies lacking intelligence, like planets or plants, act for an end, achieving goals in regular, purposive ways. But things without intelligence cannot tend toward an end unless directed by something intelligent, as an arrow is directed by an archer. Therefore, there must be an intelligent being that directs all natural things to their ends. This we call God. This argument has been revived in various forms in contemporary philosophy of religion, often under the rubric of fine-tuning or design arguments. but Thomas's version is more austere. He is not arguing from particular instances of apparent design, but from the universal fact of final causality, the fact that natural processes are regular and goal-directed. This regularity cannot be explained by the things themselves, which lack intelligence, but only by an intelligence that orders them. What do the 5 ways prove? Not everything Christians believe about God. They demonstrate that there exists a first mover, a first cause, a necessary being, a maximally perfect being, an intelligent designer. Thomas identifies this being with the God of Christian faith, but the arguments themselves do not establish the Trinity, the Incarnation, or divine revelation. They are arguments from natural reason, accessible in principle to anyone who carefully observes the world and thinks rigorously about what that observation implies. They are preambles to faith, establishing that God exists and has certain attributes, but leaving to revelation the deeper mysteries of God's inner life. Nor do the 5 ways provide the kind of certainty we get from mathematical proofs. They are metaphysical demonstrations, and their force depends on accepting certain metaphysical principles, that an infinite regress of movers or causes or necessary beings is impossible, that contingent beings require explanation, that teleology in nature requires intelligence. Someone who rejects these principles will not be convinced, but Thomas believes these principles are grounded in reality and can be defended philosophically. The arguments are sound, he maintains, even if not everyone will accept them. Having demonstrated that God exists, Thomas turns to the question of what God is. Or rather, since God's essence infinitely exceeds our comprehension, the question of what God is not. This is the path of negative theology, and it leads to the doctrine of divine simplicity, one of the most challenging and profound aspects of Thomas's thought. If we can demonstrate that God exists, can we know what God is? Thomas's answer is both yes and no. Yes, we can know certain things about God, certain attributes and perfections. But no, we cannot comprehend God's essence, cannot grasp what God is in himself. God infinitely exceeds our cognitive capacities. Our knowledge of God is real but limited, positive but inadequate. We know God by knowing what God is not, by removing from our concept of God all the limitations and imperfections we find in creatures, and by affirming in God whatever perfections exist in creatures, though in an eminent and incomprehensible way. The starting point for understanding God's nature is the doctrine of divine simplicity. This is one of the most important and most misunderstood aspects of classical theism. Divine simplicity means that God has no parts, no composition of any kind. God is not made up of components, whether physical or metaphysical. God's essence is not distinct from his existence. God's attributes are not properties added to a divine subject. God is absolutely simple, utterly one, without any complexity or composition whatsoever. This seems counterintuitive. We speak of God's wisdom, power, goodness, justice, mercy, as if they were different attributes. But Thomas insists that in God, these are all identical with each other and with God's essence. God's wisdom is God's power, is God's goodness, is God's very being. We distinguish them conceptually because our minds cannot grasp God's simplicity all at once, but in reality, there is only one divine perfection, one simple act of being, which we inadequately name with multiple terms. Why must God be simple? Because God is pure act, with no admixture of potency. Any composition involves potency, parts that could be separated, properties that could be absent, essence that could exist or not exist. But God, as the first cause and necessary being, cannot have potency. God is fully actual, completely realized, with no unrealized possibilities, no unactualized capacities. And pure act admits no composition. The real distinction between essence and existence, which holds for all creatures, does not hold for God. In God, essence and existence are identical. God does not have existence. God is existence itself, being itself subsisting. This is what the divine name revealed to Moses means. I am, he who is. God is the pure act of being, existence without limitation, being without restriction by any essence. From divine simplicity follow other attributes. God is eternal, not in the sense of lasting through infinite time, but in the sense of being utterly outside time, possessing all of existence simultaneously without succession. God has no past or future, no before or after. God's eternity is the simultaneous and complete possession of unlimited life, an ever-present now that comprehends all moments of time in a single act. God is immutable, unchanging. Change requires potency, the capacity to be other than one is. But God, being pure act, has no potency and therefore cannot change. God does not grow wiser or more powerful or better. God is already everything that God can be, without development or alteration. God is infinite, unlimited. Creatures are limited by their essences, which determine what they are and therefore what they are not. A dog is limited by dogness, a human by humanity. But God, having no essence distinct from existence, is not limited by any specific nature. God is unlimited being, infinite in perfection. God is one. There cannot be two gods because there is no principle by which God could be multiplied. Creatures are multiplied through matter. Many humans, many dogs, each individuated by its matter. But God, being simple, has no matter and no potency and therefore no principle of individuation. God is unique, singular, the only instance of pure being. These attributes are not restrictions on God, but the fullness of perfection. To be eternal is better than to be temporal. To be unchanging is better than to be mutable. To be infinite is better than to be finite. We might think change is good because it allows improvement, but that only applies to imperfect beings who lack something they could gain. God, lacking nothing, has no need of change and would be diminished by it. Divine simplicity has implications for how we understand God's knowledge, will, and power. God knows all things, but not by acquiring information or forming concepts. God knows by being, by the single eternal act that is God's existence. In knowing himself, God knows all possible beings, all actual beings, all that could be or is or was. God's knowledge is not discursive, moving from premises to conclusions, but intuitive, grasping everything in a single timeless act. God wills all things, but not by making choices or undergoing deliberation. God's will is identical with God's being, one simple act by which God wills his own goodness necessarily and all other things freely. God wills himself necessarily because divine goodness is the proper object of the divine will, and because God cannot will anything contrary to his nature. But God wills creatures freely, because creatures add nothing to divine perfection, and God would be no less perfect if they did not exist. This raises the problem of freedom in God. If God's will is identical with God's eternal, immutable being, how can God will things freely? How can there be any contingency in creation? Thomas's answer is subtle. God's act of willing is necessary and eternal, but what God wills includes both necessary and contingent things. God wills necessarily that creatures exist, but he does not will necessarily that these particular creatures exist. The necessity is in the act of willing, not in what is willed. God could have created a different world or no world at all. That he created this world is a free choice, even though the divine act of choosing is eternal and unchangeable. Divine simplicity also shapes how we understand God's relationship to creatures. God is not a being among beings, competing for metaphysical space. God is the source of being itself, the cause of existence in all things. God is intimately present to everything that exists, sustaining it in being at every moment. Yet God remains wholly distinct from creation, utterly transcendent. God is both nearer to us than we are to ourselves, because God is the cause of our very being and infinitely beyond us, incomprehensible and inexhaustible. This paradox of immanence and transcendence runs through all of Thomas's theology. God is everywhere and nowhere, in all things and beyond all things, knowable and unknowable. We can speak truly of God, but all our language fails to capture the divine reality. This brings us to one of Thomas's most important doctrines, the analogy of being and the analogical nature of our language about God. If God is utterly simple and infinitely beyond our comprehension, how can we say anything meaningful about God at all? This is not merely a theoretical problem, but a practical one. Scripture speaks of God in human terms. God knows, wills, loves, judges, creates. Theology makes claims about God's attributes. God is wise, powerful, good, just. Prayer addresses God with names and descriptions. But if God transcends all our concepts, are these not all just useful fictions, metaphors that point toward a reality they cannot capture? Thomas's answer involves the doctrine of analogy. When we predicate terms of God, we do not use them univocally, in exactly the same sense as when we predicate them of creatures. Nor do we use them equivocally, in completely different senses with no real connection. We use them analogically, in senses that are partly the same and partly different, related by a proportion or similarity, rooted in the relationship between cause and effect. Consider the term good. We say God is good and we say a person is good. If we mean good univocally, in exactly the same sense, then we are measuring God and the person by the same standard of goodness, which implies something prior to both. But there is nothing prior to God. God is the measure of all things. So we cannot mean good in exactly the same sense. But neither do we mean good equivocally, as if God's goodness had nothing in common with human goodness. There is a real similarity, because human goodness participates in, derives from, images divine goodness. The creature's goodness is analogous to God's goodness. It is similar, but not identical, related, but not equal. Thomas distinguishes different kinds of analogy. The most important for our purposes is the analogy of attribution and participation. Creatures are called good because they participate in God's goodness. They receive it from Him as effects receive being from their cause. God is called good essentially and primarily. Creatures are called good derivatively and secondarily. The term is predicated first of God, then of creatures in relation to God. But it is known to us first in creatures, then applied to God by removing limitations and affirming perfection. This means that when we say God is wise, we are saying something true. God really is wise. This is not a metaphor. But we are not saying God has wisdom in the way a human has wisdom, as a property or habit distinct from the person. God's wisdom is God's very being, identical with God's power, goodness, and existence. We distinguish these attributes conceptually, but in God they are one simple reality. Our language breaks apart what in God is utterly united, but it does so in a way that captures something real about God, not just something about our minds. Thomas also employs negative theology, the way of removing imperfections. We say God is incorporeal, not because we understand what incorporeality is positively, but because we know God lacks body. We say God is infinite, not because we grasp infinity, but because we deny limits. We say God is eternal, not because we understand timelessness, but because we exclude succession. This via negativa, the negative way, is essential because it reminds us that our positive terms, however true, are inadequate. God exceeds all our concepts. But there is also a via eminentiae, a way of eminence. We take perfections found in creatures and attribute them to God in a supereminent way, to an infinite degree. Creatures are wise in limited, imperfect ways. God is wisdom itself, unlimited and perfect. Creatures are good, participating in goodness. God is goodness itself, the source of all goodness. This method assumes that perfections in creatures derive from God, and therefore reveal something about God, though in an incomprehensibly higher mode. The most proper name for God, according to Thomas, is He who is, the name revealed to Moses. This name signifies God's essence as pure existence, being itself subsisting. It does not limit God to any category or genus, but expresses the unlimited act of being that God is. Other names, wise, good, powerful, signify different aspects of this one simple reality as our minds apprehend them, distinguishing conceptually what in God is indistinguishable. This theory of religious language has profound implications. It means theology is possible. We can speak truly about God. Our statements have real content. They are not just expressions of emotion or useful fictions. But theology is also humble. It recognizes the inadequacy of all our language, the infinite distance between our concepts and divine reality. Theological discourse is both meaningful and apophatic, affirmative and negative, saying something true while acknowledging that the fullness of truth escapes us. The doctrine of analogy also shapes how Thomas understands the relationship between faith and reason. Reason can know that God exists and can know some of God's attributes, that God is one, simple, perfect, infinite, eternal. These are the preambles of faith, accessible to philosophy. But reason cannot know God's inner life, cannot discover the Trinity of persons, or the plan of salvation, or the mystery of the Incarnation. These exceed reason's natural capacity and require revelation. Yet what is revealed does not contradict what reason knows. It completes and elevates it. There is one truth, knowable partly by reason and more fully by faith, but never contradictory. This brings us to the act by which God brings forth everything other than himself, creation. Thomas's doctrine of creation flows directly from his metaphysics of being and his understanding of God as pure act. Creation is not making things out of pre-existing material, but giving existence itself, causing being from nothing. It is the most radical form of causation imaginable, and it reveals both the power of God and the utter dependence of creatures. To create is to cause being itself, to give existence where previously there was nothing. This is what distinguishes creation from all other forms of making or producing. A carpenter makes a table from wood. The wood already exists. A sculptor shapes stone. The stone is already there. Natural processes generate new organisms from existing material. The material persists through the change. But creation brings forth the very being of things, not from something but from nothing. It is not a transformation or rearrangement of what is, but the causing of existence itself. Thomas argues that creation must be ex nihilo, from nothing, because existence is not a property that can be transferred or shared like heat or motion. When fire heats water, heat passes from the fire to the water. The fire communicates something of itself. But existence is not like that. Existence is not a transferable quality, but the act by which anything is real at all. Only a being whose essence is existence, only God who is being itself, can cause existence in others. And God's causation of existence cannot involve pre-existing material, because material already has existence. To create is to cause the whole being of a thing, not just its form or arrangement. This means creation is a free act, not a necessary emanation. God does not create because he needs anything or lacks anything. God is perfectly complete and self-sufficient. Creation adds nothing to divine perfection. If God creates, it is purely from love, from the overflowing of divine goodness that wills to communicate itself, to share being with others. Thomas insists on this point against various forms of necessitarianism. Creation is not an automatic overflow from God's nature, like light emanating from the sun. It is a free decision of divine will, even though that decision is eternal and unchangeable. One of the most interesting questions Thomas addresses is whether the world is eternal or had a beginning in time. Aristotle argued for the eternity of the world, and some medieval thinkers followed him, while others considered this heresy. Thomas's position is nuanced. He argues that reason alone cannot prove the world began in time. There is no logical contradiction in an eternally created world. Creation means dependence on God for existence, not necessarily temporal beginning. God could have been creating from all eternity, sustaining the world in being throughout an infinite past. However, we know from Scripture that the world did in fact begin in time. This is an article of faith, not a philosophical demonstration. This position angered some of Thomas's contemporaries. They accused him of undermining Scripture by saying, "Reason cannot prove creation in time." But Thomas was distinguishing carefully between what reason can demonstrate and what requires revelation. Reason can prove that the world depends on God, that it is created. But the temporal beginning is a revealed truth that reason cannot establish on its own. This distinction is typical of Thomas's method, giving reason its due while recognizing its limits. Creation establishes a relationship between God and creatures that is utterly unique. God is not a cause among causes, operating on the same level as natural causes. God is the transcendent cause of all being, present to every creature at every moment, sustaining it in existence. Without God's creative activity, nothing would be. Existence would simply cease. This is not a distant one-time act, but a continuous sustaining, a holding in being that never stops. God is intimately present to everything that exists, more interior to each thing than it is to itself, because God is the cause of its very existence. Yet creatures are real. They are not mere illusions or modes of God. Creation establishes genuine beings distinct from God, with their own natures, powers, and activities. God gives creatures not only existence, but also causal efficacy, the power to act and produce effects. The natural order has its own integrity and autonomy, operating according to its own laws. But this autonomy is not independence from God. Rather, God's causality operates on a different level, giving creatures the power to cause, while God causes the causing itself. God works through secondary causes, enabling them to act while remaining the primary cause of all that is. This leads to the concept of participation. Creatures participate in God's being. They do not possess being in their own right, but receive it. They are like sunlight, which has no light in itself, but only as it receives it from the sun. Creatures exist, but their existence is derived, dependent, limited. God exists, and God's existence is underived, independent, unlimited. Creation is the act by which the unlimited communicates being to the limited, the necessary to the contingent, the infinite to the finite. Thomas envisions creation as a hierarchy of being, with different levels of participation in divine perfection. At the top, closest to God, are the angels, pure spiritual substances without bodies. Below them are human beings, composites of spirit and matter, rational animals who bridge the gap between the material and immaterial. Lower still are non-rational animals, then plants, then inanimate substances, each participating in being according to its nature. This is not a hierarchy of value in the modern sense, but a metaphysical ordering according to degrees of actuality and perfection. The existence of angels raises interesting questions. If angels are pure intelligences without bodies, how do they differ from one another? In material creatures, matter individuates. This dog differs from that dog because each has different matter, but angels have no matter. Thomas's solution is that each angel is a distinct species, utterly unique. There are not many instances of angelhood, but many kinds of angels, each one exhausting its species. This follows from his Metaphysics. Without matter, there is no principle of individuation, so each immaterial substance must be its own species. Angels and humans share rationality, but differ in how they know. Angels grasp truth immediately through infused concepts, without needing to abstract from sense experience. Their knowledge is intuitive, not discursive. Humans, by contrast, begin with sensation, and must work their way to universal concepts through abstraction. Our knowledge is slower, more laborious, but it is genuine knowledge, capable of reaching truth. This brings us to Thomas's philosophical anthropology, his account of the human soul and how we know. The question of what a human being is might seem simple, but it has generated some of philosophy's deepest controversies. Are we essentially souls, spiritual substances temporarily housed in bodies? Are we essentially bodies, material organisms whose mental life is just complex brain activity? Are we some mysterious combination of two different substances, spirit and matter, yoked together in an uneasy union? The answers we give shape how we understand knowledge, freedom, ethics, and our ultimate destiny. Thomas's answer draws on Aristotle, but develops it in ways that solve problems Aristotle left open. A human being is a hylomorphic unity, a compound of matter and form. The soul is the form of the body, not a separate substance imprisoned in flesh. Form in Aristotelian metaphysics is the principle that actualizes matter, giving it specific being and determining what kind of thing it is. The soul is what makes a body a living human body, what organizes it, animates it, gives it human characteristics and capacities. There is not a body and a soul as two independent things but one substance, a living human being whose soul is its substantial form. This means we are not Platonic souls using bodies as instruments. We are embodied souls or unsouled bodies, depending on one's emphasis, but fundamentally we are the unity of both. The soul is not complete without the body, nor the body without the soul. This has immediate implications. Sensations are not events in a separate soul, but modifications of the whole embodied person. Emotions involve bodily changes. The human good is not escape from the body, but the perfection of our composite nature. Even in the afterlife, Thomas insists, the separated soul is incomplete. Full human flourishing requires resurrection, the reunion of soul and body. But this raises a problem. If the soul is the form of the body, tied to matter as other forms are, how can it survive death? When a dog dies, its soul, its principle of life, ceases to exist. The matter that was organized as a dog disintegrates. Why doesn't the same happen to humans? Thomas argues that the human rational soul is a special kind of form. It is subsistent. Unlike the souls of plants and animals, which exist only as actualizing matter, the human soul has an operation, intellectual thought, that does not depend on bodily organs. Because it can operate independently of matter in this one respect, it can exist independently of matter when the body dies. This is a delicate balance. The soul is the form of the body, intimately united to matter. Yet it is also subsistent, capable of existing on its own. It is not a complete substance because a human being is a composite of soul and body. But it is not a mere principle of organization either, disappearing when the body dissolves. Thomas walks a middle path between Platonic dualism and materialist reductionism, trying to preserve both the unity of the person and the survival of individual identity after death. The rational soul has two spiritual powers, intellect and will. These are immaterial faculties, not rooted in bodily organs like sight or hearing. The intellect grasps universal concepts and judges truth. The will is the rational appetite, the power to choose goods apprehended by the intellect. Below these are the sensitive powers shared with animals, the five external senses, the internal senses of imagination and memory, and the sensitive appetites or passions. And below these are the vegetative powers, shared with all living things, nutrition, growth, reproduction. All these powers belong to the one soul, which is the principle of all life functions in the human being. The soul doesn't just think, it perceives, feels, digests, grows. It is the life principle operating at many levels, from the most material to the most spiritual. This integrated vision contrasts with views that separate mind and body so sharply that their interaction becomes mysterious. For Thomas, there is no problem of interaction because there is one substance with different capacities, not two substances trying to communicate. The highest function of the human soul is intellect, the power of understanding. But how does it work? How do we grasp universal concepts from particular sense experiences? This is the problem of knowledge, one of the most important in Thomas's philosophical anthropology. His solution involves distinguishing between the agent intellect and the possible intellect, two aspects of the one intellectual power. The process begins with sensation. We see this tree, hear that sound, touch this surface. Sensation produces images or phantasms in the imagination, particular representations of individual things. But understanding grasps universals. Not this or that tree, but the nature of treeness. Not particular triangles, but the essence of triangle. How do we get from particular images to universal concepts? Not by generalization alone, because no amount of comparing particulars will reveal the necessary and universal features that belong to the essence. Thomas's answer is abstraction. The agent intellect abstracts the intelligible form from the phantasm, separating the universal from the particular, the necessary from the contingent. It illuminates the phantasm, making the universal structure implicit in it explicitly intelligible. The possible intellect then receives this abstracted form, becoming informed by it, and thereby knows the universal nature. We don't see treeness with our eyes. We abstract it from many perceptions of particular trees, and then understand what a tree is in its essence. This account has several important implications. First, all human knowledge begins with sensation. We are not born with innate ideas, as Plato thought. The mind at birth is like a blank slate, a purely potential intellect with no actual content. Only through sense experience do we acquire intelligible forms. Second, the intellect is immaterial. It grasps universals, which are not material, and it does so through an operation that abstracts from material conditions. This is why the soul can survive bodily death. It has an immaterial operation and therefore an immaterial principle. Third, knowledge is a kind of union between knower and known. When I know a tree, the form of the tree exists in my intellect, not materially as it exists in the tree itself, but immaterially, intentionally. The knower becomes the known in a certain way, not by being transformed into a tree, but by receiving the tree's form in an immaterial mode. This is how knowledge expands us, makes us more than ourselves. We take in the forms of other things without losing our own identity. Thomas's epistemology is neither naive realism nor skepticism. We really know external reality. Knowledge is of things as they are, not just of our ideas. But we know things through species, through the forms abstracted from phantasms, not directly. The intellect judges whether its concepts correspond to reality by referring back to sense experience and by the natural light of first principles, self-evident truths like the principle of non-contradiction. Error arises when the intellect judges without sufficient evidence or when it extends concepts beyond their proper sphere. This account of knowledge grounds Thomas's understanding of truth. Truth is not mere coherence of ideas or pragmatic usefulness. Truth is the adequation of intellect to thing, the conformity of thought to reality. When I judge that the tree is green and the tree is in fact green, my judgment is true because it corresponds to how things are. This correspondence theory of truth assumes a realist metaphysics. There are real natures out there to be known, and our minds are capable of grasping them, however imperfectly. But knowledge is not the only intellectual operation. There is also will, the rational appetite, the power to choose. And with will comes the question of freedom, one of the most critical issues for understanding human nature and human responsibility. The will is the rational appetite, the power by which we tend toward goods apprehended by the intellect. Just as the intellect is the power of knowing truth, the will is the power of loving good. Every agent acts for an end, Aristotle taught, and Thomas agrees. But rational agents, unlike irrational ones, can deliberate about ends and choose means. We are not determined by instinct or appetite alone, but can reflect on our goals and decide how to pursue them. This is freedom, the power of self-direction, of choosing among genuine alternatives. But what is the relationship between intellect and will? Does the intellect determine the will, showing it what is good and thereby necessitating choice? Or does the will determine the intellect, directing it what to think about? Thomas's answer is characteristic. Both are true in different ways. The intellect moves the will by presenting it with objects, by showing what is good. The will moves the intellect by directing it what to consider, by choosing to attend to this rather than that. They are reciprocally related, each influencing the other in its own manner. The key to understanding freedom lies in recognizing that while we necessarily will happiness in general, we do not necessarily will any particular good. The will is naturally oriented toward the good, toward happiness as such. We cannot will our own misery as an end, it would be a contradiction. But no finite good completely satisfies our desire for happiness. Each particular good is limited, imperfect, desirable in some respects, but lacking in others. Therefore, the will is not necessitated by any particular finite good. We can choose it or not, we can turn toward it or away, because we can always see some aspect under which it is not good. This is the root of freedom. We are not neutral with respect to good in general. We must will our own flourishing. But we are free with respect to particular goods because none of them is the complete good. Only God, the perfect and infinite good, would necessitate the will if seen clearly. But in this life, we do not see God clearly. We know God exists perhaps, but we do not behold the divine essence. Therefore, even our will toward God can be resisted through weakness, ignorance, or malice. We are free to turn from God, though in doing so we turn from our own ultimate fulfillment. Thomas analyzes the act of choice in detail. It begins with the intellect's apprehension of an end, then the will's willing that end, then the intellect's deliberation about means, then the will's choice of a particular means, then the intellect's command to act, then the will's execution through the relevant powers. At each stage, intellect and will cooperate, guiding action through reason and desire together. This process can go wrong at any point. The intellect can err in judgment, the will can be weak in execution, passions can interfere with clear thinking or firm choosing. The passions are not enemies of reason or will, but natural movements of the sensitive appetite that need to be ordered by reason. The sensitive appetite, which we share with animals, inclines us toward perceived goods, and away from perceived evils. The concupiscible appetite moves us toward pleasurable goods and away from painful evils, love and desire, joy and sorrow, hatred and aversion. The irascible appetite responds to difficult goods and evils, hope and despair, courage and fear, anger. These passions are not in themselves sinful or irrational. They are part of our embodied nature and contribute to human flourishing when properly ordered. The problem arises when passions resist reason's direction or overwhelm it. Fear might make us flee when courage is needed. Anger might drive us to unjust revenge. Desire might lead us to pursue pleasure at the cost of virtue. But the solution is not to eliminate passion, which would be impossible and undesirable, but to train it, to habituate the sensitive appetite to follow reason's lead. This is the work of moral virtue, and it is achieved through practice, through repeatedly choosing well until right action becomes second nature. Thomas's account of freedom is incompatibilist. He holds that genuine freedom is incompatible with causal determinism. If our choices are determined by prior causes, they are not free. But his incompatibilism is not libertarian in the modern sense. He does not think freedom requires indeterminacy at the physical level or that free acts are uncaused. Rather, free acts are self-caused in a special way. The agent is the source of the action, choosing from among real alternatives according to reasons, not merely following the strongest desire or external compulsion. This account has important implications for moral responsibility. We are responsible for our actions precisely because we are free, because we could have chosen otherwise. Sin is freely turning from God toward lesser goods. Virtue is freely ordering ourselves toward the ultimate good. Grace does not destroy freedom, but heals and elevates it, enabling us to will and do what we could not otherwise will or do. The relationship between grace and freedom is one of Thomas's most delicate theological problems, but his fundamental conviction is clear. God works through our freedom, not against it. Freedom also means we can fail, can make ourselves miserable through bad choices. This is the tragedy of human life and the necessity of ethics. If we are to flourish, to achieve our ultimate end, we need to know what that end is and how to reach it. We need to understand what happiness really consists in and what dispositions, what virtues will get us there. This is the subject of Thomas's ethics, his analysis of the good life and how to live it. Every agent acts for an end, Thomas repeats throughout his ethics. We do not act randomly or arbitrarily, but always for the sake of something we take to be good. Even when we choose badly, we choose under the aspect of good. We see something desirable in what we choose, even if we are mistaken about its true value. This teleological framework is fundamental to Thomas's moral philosophy. Ethics is not primarily about following rules or calculating consequences, but about understanding our end and ordering our lives toward it. But what is our ultimate end, the final goal for the sake of which we do everything else? It must be something complete and self-sufficient, something that leaves nothing further to be desired. It must be something we pursue for its own sake, not as a means to something else. And it must be something genuinely satisfying, capable of fulfilling human nature completely. This ultimate end, Thomas argues, is happiness beatitudo. But what is happiness? Many things are called happiness but are not the genuine article. Wealth is not happiness. It is pursued for the sake of other things, and it cannot satisfy our rational nature. Honour is not happiness. It depends on others' opinions and is too fragile to be ultimate. Pleasure is not happiness. It follows upon but does not constitute the good, and sensory pleasures are too limited to fulfill rational creatures. Power is not happiness. It can be used for evil as well as good, and leaves the will unsatisfied. Even health and virtue, though genuine goods, are not the complete good. They are ordered towards something further. Perfect happiness, Thomas argues, consists in the vision of God, the beatific vision. Only God, the infinite and perfect good, can completely satisfy the human intellect and will. The intellect seeks truth, and God is truth itself. The will seeks good, and God is goodness itself. To know God as God is, to see the divine essence face to face, to love God perfectly with no obstacle or imperfection, this is the fulfillment of human nature, the supreme happiness for which we were created. But this perfect happiness is not attainable in this life. We cannot see God's essence while in the body. Our knowledge of God is mediated through creatures and concepts. We cannot love God perfectly while subject to the distractions and temptations of earthly existence. Perfect happiness is eschatological, reserved for the life to come, the state of the blessed in heaven. This life is a journey toward that end, not the arrival. Does this mean there is no happiness in this life? No, Thomas says. There is imperfect happiness, a relative fulfillment achievable through virtue and contemplation. The life of virtue brings a kind of happiness, the satisfaction of living well, the joy of right action, the peace of a well-ordered soul. The life of contemplation, especially contemplation of divine things, brings a higher happiness, the pleasure of understanding, the engagement of our highest power with its proper object. The philosopher or theologian who spends life in study and thought experiences genuine happiness, though incomplete and mixed with difficulties. This distinction between perfect and imperfect happiness is crucial. It means morality is not futile, even though we cannot reach ultimate fulfillment in this life. It means the pursuit of virtue and wisdom is intrinsically valuable, not just as means to a distant end. But it also means we must not confuse earthly satisfactions with ultimate fulfillment. No achievement, no pleasure, no relationship in this life can give us what only God can give. To seek perfect happiness in creatures is to doom ourselves to frustration and despair. Thomas's ethics is eudaimonistic. It is centered on human flourishing, on happiness rightly understood. But it is not egoistic. The pursuit of happiness is not selfish, because true happiness consists in the vision and love of God, which is the most self-transcending thing possible. And the path to happiness requires virtue, especially charity, which orders us to love God above all and to love our neighbour as ourselves. The happy person is not the self-centered person, but the one whose loves are rightly ordered. This framework shapes how Thomas thinks about all moral questions. An action is good if it conduces to our ultimate end, bad if it leads away from it. But judging this requires wisdom. We must understand human nature, the true hierarchy of goods, the circumstances of action. We must develop dispositions, virtues, that enable us to act well consistently. We must recognize that we cannot achieve happiness by our own power alone, but need divine grace. And we must understand the natural law, the rational principles that guide us toward our end. Law, in Thomas's analysis, is an ordinance of reason for the common good, promulgated by one who has care of the community. This definition applies analogously at different levels. There is eternal law, God's rational ordering of all creation toward its proper ends. There is natural law, the participation of rational creatures in the eternal law through their reason. There is human law, the particular determinations of natural law made by human legislators. And there is divine law, the commands revealed in Scripture that direct us toward our supernatural end. Eternal law is the plan in God's mind by which all things are ordered to their ends. It is not a set of arbitrary commands, but the rational structure of creation itself, the way God intends things to be and to act. Everything in the universe participates in eternal law, stones by obeying laws of physics, plants by growing towards sunlight, animals by following instinct. but only rational creatures participate consciously, through understanding and choice. We can know the law and conform ourselves to it freely, or violate it deliberately. Natural law is this conscious participation in eternal law. It is the rational creature's grasp of the basic principles of practical reason, the fundamental directives that guide action toward human flourishing. The first principle of practical reason, the foundation of all natural law, is that good is to be pursued and evil avoided. This is self-evident and indemonstrable, the starting point of all ethical reasoning. From it flow more specific precepts based on natural human inclinations. Thomas identifies several fundamental inclinations that ground the precepts of natural law. First, we share with all substances an inclination to preserve our own existence. From this follows the precept that we should preserve our life and avoid whatever destroys it. Second, we share with all animals an inclination to procreate and care for offspring. From this follows precepts regarding sexual ethics and family life. Third, we have a specifically rational inclination to know truth about God and to live in society. From this follows precepts about pursuing truth, avoiding ignorance, not harming others, and contributing to social order. These are very general principles, and Thomas knows that applying them to particular cases requires judgment and can be difficult. The more specific we get, the more room there is for variation and disagreement. The basic precept that we should do good and avoid evil holds universally and is known by everyone with the use of reason. More specific precepts, like the prohibition of murder or theft, also hold universally, but can be obscured by bad customs or vicious habits. Even more particular determinations, like the details of property law or traffic regulations, vary legitimately across cultures and circumstances. This means natural law is not a rigid code, but a rational framework requiring application and prudence. It does not tell us exactly how to act in every situation, but gives us fundamental principles and directs us to reason carefully about how to apply them. Different cultures can legitimately organize themselves in different ways, create different legal systems, value different goods, so long as they respect the basic precepts of natural law. Natural law also provides the foundation for human law. Human laws are just when they derive from natural law, either as conclusions from its principles or as particular determinations of general precepts. Laws against murder derive from the natural law prohibition against unjustly taking human life. Laws about which side of the road to drive on are particular determinations. Natural law requires social order, and traffic laws specify that requirement for particular conditions. Unjust laws, laws that violate natural law, do not bind in conscience, though we might obey them to avoid greater evils like social disorder. Thomas's natural law theory is teleological. It is grounded in an understanding of human nature and human flourishing. We can know the basic precepts of natural law because we can know our nature and our inclinations. We are rational animals with certain biological needs, certain social needs, certain spiritual needs. Natural law directs us to fulfill these needs in ways that perfect our nature rather than degrade it. This requires a robust understanding of what human nature is, what humans are for, what constitutes genuine flourishing. But natural law alone is not sufficient for our complete guidance. Because we have a supernatural end, the beatific vision, which exceeds our natural capacities, we need divine law to direct us toward it. Scripture reveals moral precepts that go beyond what reason can discover. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. The commandment to love our enemies. The counsels of perfection regarding poverty, chastity, and obedience. Divine law does not contradict natural law, but supplements and elevates it. The relationship between natural law and divine law parallels the relationship between nature and grace, between philosophy and theology, between reason and faith. They are distinct but complementary. Natural law shows us how to live well in this world, how to achieve imperfect happiness through virtue. Divine law shows us how to reach perfect happiness, how to be united with God in the next life. Both are necessary for a complete ethics. But knowing the law, whether natural or divine, is not enough. We need not just knowledge but virtue, settled dispositions that enable us to act well consistently. We need to train our passions, develop our judgment, strengthen our will. This is the work of a lifetime, and it requires understanding what virtue is and how it is acquired. Virtue is a habit, a settled disposition that inclines us to act well. It is not a feeling or a single action, but a stable quality of character, developed over time through repeated good choices. The virtuous person does not just occasionally do the right thing through effort and struggle. The virtuous person habitually chooses well, almost effortlessly, because right action has become second nature. Virtue is perfected human nature, excellence in activity, the fullest development of our capacities. Thomas distinguishes intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Intellectual virtues perfect the intellect in its pursuit of truth. Some, like understanding and science, perfect the speculative intellect that knows truth for its own sake. Others, like prudence and art, perfect the practical intellect that directs action. Moral virtues perfect the appetites, both the will and the sensitive appetites, disposing them to follow reason's direction. The cardinal virtues are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. They are called cardinal from the Latin cardo, hinge, because all other moral virtues hinge on them. Prudence is right reason about action, the intellectual virtue that judges what should be done in particular circumstances. It sees the end, deliberates about means, and commands the action. Without prudence, no other moral virtue is fully virtue, because without it we cannot judge rightly what to do. Justice is the constant will to give each person his due. It orders us to others, ensuring we respect their rights and contribute to the common good. Justice is not just about fairness in distribution, but about right relationship in all of social life. It includes particular virtues like truthfulness, gratitude, and obedience, all of which give others what we owe them. Fortitude is firmness of spirit in doing good despite difficulties. It enables us to face danger, endure suffering, and persist in virtue even when it costs us dearly. Fortitude is not recklessness or insensibility to danger, but rational courage, facing what should be faced, enduring what should be endured for the sake of what is good. Temperance moderates our desire for pleasurable goods, especially bodily pleasures. It is not denial of pleasure or hatred of the body, but the rational ordering of physical appetites. The temperate person enjoys food, drink, sex, rest, but in due measure and for proper ends, not to excess or in ways that degrade human dignity. Each of these cardinal virtues ramifies into many particular virtues. Under prudence are memory, insight, docility, and shrewdness. Under justice are piety, respect, gratitude, and vindication. Under fortitude are magnanimity, patience, and perseverance. Under temperance are humility, meekness, and modesty. Thomas analyzes each in detail, showing how it contributes to human flourishing and how it can be cultivated. But the cardinal virtues are natural virtues, acquired through practice and perfected by habit. There are also supernatural virtues, infused by God, that direct us toward our supernatural end. These are the theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. They are called theological because their object is God. Faith believes God, hope trusts God, charity loves God. They are infused because they cannot be acquired by human effort, but only given by grace. Faith is the virtue by which we assent to revealed truth on the authority of God who reveals it. It is an act of intellect, but moved by will and enabled by grace. Faith goes beyond reason but does not contradict it. It accepts mysteries like the Trinity and Incarnation that reason could never discover, but that do not violate reason's principles. Faith is the foundation of the Christian life, the first response to God's revelation. Hope is the virtue by which we trust in God's promises and confidently expect perfect happiness. It is future-oriented, resting on God's power and goodness, reaching toward the beatific vision. Hope enables us to persevere in difficulties, to endure trials, to keep striving for our ultimate end despite obstacles. Without hope, despair would paralyze us. With hope, we move forward in confidence. Charity is the virtue by which we love God above all things and our neighbour for God's sake. It is the queen of virtues, the form and life of all the others. Without charity, even faith and hope are incomplete. They can exist without charity, but they are not living virtues. Charity transforms everything, giving all our actions their ultimate meaning and value. When we act from charity, we act for God, and our actions have merit for eternal life. Thomas insists that charity specifically is infused, not acquired. We cannot learn to love God above all things by practice or effort. This love must be poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. It is pure gift, grace. But once infused, charity can grow through acts, and it can be lost through mortal sin. The moral life in Thomas's vision is not just natural effort, but cooperation with grace, the working out of our salvation in the power of God. The virtues, both natural and theological, are interconnected. Prudence requires the moral virtues to order the passions so reason can judge clearly. The moral virtues require prudence to direct them to right action. All the virtues require charity to order them to the ultimate end, and all of them grow together. Increasing in one tends to increase in all. Declining in one tends to weaken all. The virtuous person is not perfect in one respect and deficient in others, but growing in integrated human excellence. But virtue alone is not enough. We can acquire natural virtues through practice, and they help us live well in this world. But they cannot take us to perfect happiness. They cannot give us the beatific vision. For that we need grace, the supernatural gift that heals our fallen nature and elevates us beyond our natural capacities. This is Thomas's doctrine of grace, perhaps the most theological dimension of his moral thought, but essential to his vision of human destiny. The human person, in Thomas's vision, is a creature of nature and grace. We have a natural end, imperfect happiness, achievable through virtue and contemplation in this life. But we also have a supernatural end, perfect happiness in the vision of God, which infinitely exceeds our natural capacities. Nature cannot reach this end by its own power. We need grace, the free gift of God that heals our wounded nature and elevates us to participation in divine life. Grace is necessary first because of sin. Human nature, as created by God, was good and ordered toward its end. But original sin, the primal turning away from God, wounded our nature in specific ways. It darkened our intellect, making it harder to know truth. It weakened our will, making it harder to choose good. It disordered our passions, making them resist reason's direction. It left us prone to ignorance, malice, weakness, and disordered desire. We can still do good, still know truth, still act virtuously to some degree. Nature is wounded, not destroyed. But we cannot consistently live well without healing grace. More radically, grace is necessary even for unfallen nature to reach its supernatural end. The beatific vision is not something nature has a right to or could achieve, given enough time and effort. It is a gift, an elevation of the creature beyond what it could be or do by its own power. To see God as God requires a transformation of the intellect, making it capable of an act that exceeds all natural capacities. To love God perfectly requires a transformation of the will, enabling it to love with a charity that is participation in God's own love. This transformation is grace. Thomas distinguishes sanctifying grace, which makes us holy and pleasing to God, from actual grace, which helps us in particular actions. Sanctifying grace is a permanent quality of the soul, a participation in divine nature that makes us children of God and heirs of heaven. It is lost by mortal sin and restored by sacramental absolution. Actual grace is a transient divine assistance that moves us to good acts, enlightens our intellect, strengthens our will, enables us to cooperate with God's purposes. We need both kinds of grace constantly. Grace does not destroy nature but perfects it. This is a key Thomistic principle. God works through our natural capacities, not against them or apart from them. Grace heals our wounded intellect, but it does not replace thinking with direct divine dictation. Grace strengthens our will, but it does not override our freedom. Grace orders our passions, but it does not eliminate them or make us into pure spirits. We remain human beings, rational animals with bodies and emotions and limitations. Grace makes us more fully human, not less. The relationship between grace and freedom is subtle and has generated enormous theological debate. Some worry that if grace is necessary for every good act, then we are not truly free. Others worry that if we contribute to our salvation, then grace is not truly gratuitous. Thomas navigates between these concerns by distinguishing different kinds of causality. God causes our good acts as primary cause, giving us existence and the power to act. We cause our good acts as secondary causes, freely choosing and executing them. God's causality does not compete with ours, but operates on a different level, making our causality possible. This means predestination is real. God from eternity chooses some for salvation and provides them with the grace necessary to reach it. But predestination does not destroy freedom. Those who are saved through their own free choices, which God both foresees and causes. Those who are damned through their own free rejection of grace, which God permits but does not cause. This is mysterious, and Thomas acknowledges limits to what we can understand about how divine sovereignty and human freedom relate. But he insists on both. God's grace is efficacious, achieving its purpose, and our choices are free, genuinely ours. The sacraments are the ordinary means by which grace is given. Baptism washes away original sin and infuses sanctifying grace. The Eucharist nourishes the Christian life with Christ's own body and blood. Penance restores grace lost through sin. Confirmation strengthens us for witness. Matrimony and holy orders sanctify particular vocations. Anointing of the sick prepares us for death. Each sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. Working ex opere operato, by the very performance of the rite, not depending on the worthiness of the minister or recipient beyond basic intention and lack of obstacle. Thomas's sacramental theology is realistic. The sacraments really give grace. They are not mere symbols or reminders. In the Eucharist, he teaches transubstantiation. The substance of bread and wine are converted into the substance of Christ's body and blood, though the accidents, the appearances, remain. This is a mystery, not explicable by natural philosophy, but it follows from Christ's words, "This is my body," taken literally and from the fittingness of God giving himself completely to us in this sacrament. The doctrine of grace completes Thomas's ethical and spiritual vision. We are called to happiness, to perfection, to union with God. But we cannot reach this on our own. We need God's help at every step. to know what to do, to choose it, to execute it, to persevere to the end. The Christian life is cooperation with grace, a synergy of divine gift and human response. We are not passive recipients of grace, nor are we self-sufficient agents. We are creatures being perfected by our Creator, children growing into the likeness of our Father, pilgrims journeying toward a home we could never reach alone. This vision of nature and grace, reason and faith, philosophy and theology, all harmonizing under God's providence, is the heart of Thomas's synthesis. It is what made him great and what made him controversial. It is what inspired centuries of Thomists and what provoked the condemnation of 1277. It is a vision of extraordinary coherence and beauty, but also one that leaves mysteries untouched and questions unanswered. And it is a vision that, for all its systematic completeness, Thomas himself came to see as inadequate when confronted with a reality that exceeded all his formulations. On December 6, 1273, Thomas was celebrating Mass in the chapel of St. Nicholas in Naples. During the Mass, something happened. We do not know what. There was no visible miracle, no voice from heaven that anyone else heard, no apparition witnessed by others. But Thomas underwent an experience so profound that it changed everything. When the Mass ended, he ceased writing. His secretary, Reginald of Piperno, who had been with him for years and knew his habits, was alarmed. The Summa Theologica was unfinished. Thomas had been working on the treatise on penance in part 3. There was much more to do. The remaining sacraments, the resurrection, the last things. Why had he stopped? Reginald urged him to continue. Thomas refused. Reginald pressed harder, worried about his master's health and state of mind. Thomas finally replied with words that have echoed through the centuries. I can write no more. I have seen such things that everything I have written seems like straw to me. Straw. Worthless, dry, fit only for burning. All his careful arguments, his precise distinctions, his hundreds of questions and thousands of articles. Straw. What did he see? We cannot know with certainty. Thomas did not describe it, perhaps could not describe it. Reginald tried to get him to explain, but Thomas would only say that all his theological writings were straw compared to what had been shown to him. Some speculate it was a vision of the divine essence, a foretaste of the beatific vision that would be his in heaven. Others suggest it was a mystical experience of God's presence so overwhelming that words became impossible. Still others wonder if it was a psychological or spiritual crisis, a dark night of the soul in which all his intellectual achievements seemed empty. Whatever it was not a repudiation of his life's work. Thomas did not burn his writings or declare them false. He did not recant or renounce his positions. He simply stopped adding to them. The experience did not invalidate what he had written but revealed its inadequacy. Everything true he had said about God remained true, but it was like describing the sun to someone who has only read about it and then seeing the sun itself. The description is accurate as far as it goes, but the reality infinitely exceeds the description. For 3 more months Thomas lived. He did not write, but he spoke, prayed, prepared for death. In February 1274, Pope Gregory X summoned him to attend the Second Council of Lyon, a gathering meant to heal the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. Thomas set out, though he was already ill. He never arrived. On the journey, he struck his head on a fallen tree branch. The injury worsened his condition. He was taken to the Cistercian monastery at Fossa Nova, where he asked to stay in the abbey rather than the guest house, saying it was fitting for a Dominican to die among religious. At Fossa Nova, he lingered for several weeks, growing weaker. The monks asked him to comment on the Song of Songs, and he gave them a few lectures, his last teaching. He received the last sacraments and made his confession. He asked for the Eucharist to be brought to him and greeted it with tears, saying, "I receive you, price of my soul's redemption. All my studies, my vigils, my labours have been for love of you." On March 7th, 1274, Thomas Aquinas died. He was 49 years old. The Summa Theologica remained unfinished, a monument whose incomplete state testifies to the gulf between human knowledge and divine reality. The immediate aftermath was complicated. 3 years after Thomas's death, the Bishop of Paris, Stephen Tempier, issued a condemnation of 219 propositions taught at the University of Paris. The condemnation did not name Thomas explicitly, but some of the condemned propositions were his: that the world might be eternal, that there is only one substantial form in a composite substance, that the intellective soul is the form of the body. The condemnation was aimed primarily at Averroists, but it swept up Thomas as well. Some of his Dominican brothers protested. Some theologians defended him. But for a time, Thomism was suspect, associated with dangerous novelties. Yet Thomas's reputation grew. His students compiled indexes and concordances to his works. His order defended his teaching. Theologians found his syntheses helpful in resolving disputes. By 1323, less than 50 years after his death, Pope John XXIII canonized him as a saint. In 1325, the Bishop of Paris retracted the condemnation insofar as it touched Thomas's doctrine. In 1567, Pope Pius V declared him a Doctor of the Church, the Angelic Doctor. His feast day was established, and his teaching was held up as a model of Catholic theology. But the story did not end there. Thomas became not just a saint, but a school, a method, a tradition. Thomism emerged as a distinct philosophical approach, with commentators and interpreters elaborating, defending, and developing his thought. The second scholasticism of the 16th and 17th centuries saw figures like Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, and Francisco Suarez engage deeply with Thomas's texts, applying them to new questions and controversies. Thomism was taught in seminaries and universities, shaping generations of Catholic theologians and philosophers. In 1879, Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Aeterni Patris, calling for a renewal of Thomistic philosophy as the basis for Catholic education and intellectual life. This sparked a Thomistic revival that lasted well into the 20th century. Thinkers like Etienne Gilson, Jacques Maritain, and Joseph Pieper recovered Thomas's thought for modern audiences, showing its relevance to contemporary problems. They defended realist metaphysics against idealism, natural law against relativism, the harmony of faith and reason against secularism and fideism. In the late 20th century, a new movement called analytical Thomism emerged, bringing Thomistic ideas into dialogue with Anglo-American analytic philosophy. Philosophers like Elizabeth Anscombe, Peter Geach, and later John Haldane, and Eleanor Stump showed that Thomas's arguments about virtue, causation, the mind, and God could be formulated in terms acceptable to contemporary philosophical discourse. They demonstrated that Thomas was not just a historical figure, but a living conversation partner whose insights remained valuable. The question of Thomas Aquinas' legacy is the question of whether faith and reason can coexist, whether a comprehensive account of reality can integrate revelation and philosophy, whether the life of the mind can be a form of religious devotion. For 8 centuries, that question has been answered in the affirmative by those who study Thomas, and in the negative by those who reject his synthesis. What is undeniable is that the question itself remains urgent. Thomas's influence on Catholic theology is incalculable. The Catechism of the Catholic Church cites him more than any other theologian. Catholic moral theology, especially its understanding of natural law and virtue, is deeply Thomistic. Catholic philosophical theology, with its arguments for God's existence and its analysis of divine attributes, follows paths Thomas traced. Even Catholic social teaching, with its emphasis on the common good and the dignity of the human person, reflects Thomistic principles. Beyond Catholicism, Thomas has influenced broader philosophical debates. His virtue ethics contributed to the contemporary revival of virtue theory, offering an alternative to both deontological and consequentialist approaches. His philosophy of mind, with its analysis of abstraction and intentionality, has engaged philosophers working in cognitive science and philosophy of perception. His natural law theory remains central to debates about ethics, politics, and jurisprudence, offering a framework for moral realism and objective values. Thomas's metaphysics, particularly the real distinction between essence and existence, has been both defended and criticized by metaphysicians. Some see it as the key to avoiding both nihilism and pantheism, grounding a robust account of created reality dependent on but distinct from God. Others find it obscure or unnecessary, preferring alternative accounts of being and causation. The debate continues, a sign that Thomas's ideas remain philosophically live, not just historically important. Perhaps most significantly, Thomas's model of integrating faith and reason speaks to our age's struggles with religious pluralism, secularism, and the relationship between science and religion. He showed that one could be both a rigorous philosopher and a faithful Christian, that revelation and reason need not compete, but can complement each other. He demonstrated that theology can be systematic and rational without losing mystery, that philosophy can be autonomous without becoming arrogant, that faith can engage with culture and learning without being diluted. This is not to say Thomas's synthesis is unproblematic or that all his answers are correct. Many of his arguments depend on Aristotelian physics and metaphysics that modern science has challenged. His political philosophy reflects medieval social structures that we no longer accept. Some of his ethical positions, particularly regarding women and sexuality, strike contemporary readers as troubling. His account of grace and freedom remains deeply contested even among those sympathetic to his project. Moreover, the vision Thomas offered of a comprehensive system integrating all knowledge under theological principles is difficult to sustain in a pluralistic world where Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, secularists, and others coexist, and where specialized sciences pursue knowledge independently of theological frameworks. The dream of Christendom, of a unified Christian culture where philosophy served theology and all learning pointed toward God, has largely collapsed in the West. Thomas wrote for a world that no longer exists, yet the fundamental questions he addressed remain. Is there an ultimate reality underlying the flux of appearances? Can we know truth objectively, or are we trapped in subjectivity? Is there a moral law grounded in human nature, or is ethics merely cultural preference? Can faith and reason both be sources of knowledge, or must we choose between them? These are not medieval questions but perennial ones, and Thomas's careful, rigorous attempts to answer them still offer insights. His method, too, remains instructive. The willingness to engage seriously with opponents, to state their arguments fairly before refuting them, to follow evidence wherever it leads while maintaining core commitments, these are virtues in intellectual life that transcend any particular philosophical school. Thomas's charity in argument, his precision in defining terms, his patience in building complex cases, his humility before mystery, these model what philosophical and theological discourse should be. And there is the man himself, the dumb ox who bellowed across the centuries. Large and silent, utterly absorbed in questions that most people never think about, weeping over the suffering of Christ, declaring all his massive achievement to be straw compared to a vision we cannot share. He reminds us that the life of the mind, however rigorous and systematic, points beyond itself toward a reality that eludes our grasp. He embodies the tension between the human need to understand and the divine transcendence that exceeds understanding. In the end, Thomas Aquinas matters not because he gave us all the answers, but because he showed us how to pursue questions that matter. He demonstrated that it is possible to be both intellectually honest and religiously committed, both philosophically rigorous and theologically orthodox, both confident in reason's power and humble before revelation's mysteries. Whether one accepts his conclusions or not, the integrity of his pursuit commands respect. 8 centuries after his death, as the Bishop of Paris was condemning his teaching, Thomas's words about truth apply to his own legacy. All truth, whoever speaks it, comes from the Holy Spirit. The measure of his thought is not whether it bears his name, but whether it grasps reality. Those who study him seriously find much that does grasp reality and much that illuminates the human condition. They also find much that is dated, much that is questionable, much that provokes disagreement, but perhaps that is as it should be. Thomas did not seek disciples who would merely repeat his formulas, but students who would think for themselves, who would engage with arguments on their merits, who would pursue truth wherever it led. He would not want us to accept his authority, but to follow his example, to read widely, to think carefully, to argue fairly, to remain humble before what we do not know, and to trust that faith and reason rightly understood cannot ultimately conflict because both come from the same God who is truth itself. On that December day in 1273, when Thomas saw something that reduced all his writings to straw, he glimpsed what awaits all who pursue truth sincerely. A reality so overwhelmingly beautiful and real that all our words fail before it. Until we see that reality face to face, we continue the work Thomas began, building careful arguments, making necessary distinctions, defending truth as we understand it. We build, as he did, cathedrals of thought that point upward toward what they cannot contain. And we remember that the pointing matters more than the structure, that the journey matters more than our descriptions of it, that truth is found not in arriving at answers, but in the faithful pursuit itself. The Summa Theologica remains unfinished, and so does every human intellectual project, but the pursuit continues, and in that pursuit the bellowing of the dumb ox still echoes, calling us to think more carefully, to love truth more deeply, to remain humble before mystery, and to trust that in the end all our straw-like words will be consumed in the fire of divine love, and we will know even as we are known. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. I'd be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you'd like more of this kind of content, please subscribe to Sleepy Philosophy Radio. And if you want to support the channel, you can become a member or use the links in the description. Either way, I appreciate you being here. Take care.